May 14, 1920. Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company, Virginia. Captain Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the docks watching 3 destroyers under construction simultaneously on parallel ways, American workers swarming over the hulls with a coordination that looked almost choreographed. Around him, the industrial symphony of modern shipbuilding played at a volume and tempo that had no equivalent in Japan. Rivet guns hammered. Cranes swung prefabricated sections into position. Welding torches sparked. And every 16 days, on average, a completed warship slid down the ways into the water. Yamamoto had brought a notebook. He was recording specific observations, calculating production rates, measuring the time required for various construction phases. His escort, a polite but increasingly uncomfortable U.S. Navy liaison officer, had stopped trying to hurry him along. The Japanese captain was methodical, almost obsessive in his documentation. He walked the length of each construction way, studied the organization of work crews, examined the prefabrication yards where standardized components were mass-produced before assembly. What Yamamoto was witnessing wasn't just impressive industrial capacity. It was a fundamental difference in philosophy about how nations wage war. In Japan, skilled craftsmen built warships one at a time, each vessel a work of maritime art requiring years of careful construction. Here, shipbuilding had been reduced to assembly, to standardized components fitted together by workers who might have been building automobiles 6 months earlier. The approach offended traditional notions of craftsmanship, but the mathematics were undeniable. This single American shipyard could outproduce Japan's entire naval construction program. That evening, in his room at the naval officers' quarters, Yamamoto wrote a report that would be filed, read by a few officers in Tokyo, and largely ignored. In it, he stated a conclusion that would prove prophetic 21 years later. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America. He had no idea that 2 decades later, he would plan the most devastating surprise attack in naval history against this very nation. And he had even less idea that his observations on these Virginia docks, watching ships being built faster than Japan could count them, had already calculated the mathematical certainty of his nation's defeat. What if I told you that the man who planned Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor had already concluded Japan could not win a war with America before he ever became an admiral? That standing on American soil, watching the industrial heartbeat of a nation that produced more steel in a month than Japan produced in a year, one Japanese officer understood with absolute clarity that any extended conflict between these two powers could have only one conclusion. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto. And the moment he truly understood Japan's fate didn't come on a battlefield. It came on the docks of American shipyards in the 1920s, watching an industrial colossus that Japan could never hope to match. On December 8, 1941, as smoke still rose from the shattered battleships at Pearl Harbor, Japanese admirals celebrated in Tokyo. They had achieved tactical surprise beyond their most optimistic projections. 8 American battleships damaged or destroyed. Nearly 2,500 Americans killed. The Pacific Fleet crippled. Emperor Hirohito's military advisors spoke confidently of 6 months of unchallenged expansion across the Pacific. They saw Pearl Harbor as proof of Japanese superiority, validation of their spiritual strength over American materialism. Admiral Yamamoto did not celebrate. Alone in his quarters aboard the flagship Nagato, he reportedly told his staff that they had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve. His colleagues dismissed this as false modesty or temporary doubt. They didn't understand. Yamamoto wasn't expressing a feeling. He was stating a mathematical certainty he had calculated years earlier, standing on American soil, watching a nation build ships faster than Japan could count them. This is the story of how one man's direct observation of American industrial capacity led him to the most accurate strategic assessment of the Pacific War before it even began. This is about the profound disconnect between what Yamamoto knew and what Japan's military leadership believed. And this is about how first-hand experience with American manufacturing created a prophet who could see his nation's defeat with perfect clarity, yet was powerless to prevent it. The foundation of Yamamoto's understanding began not with military strategy or battlefield tactics, but with his unusual education and career path within the Imperial Japanese Navy. Born Isoroku Takano in 1884 in Nagyaka, Niigata Prefecture, he was the 6th son of a former samurai family. His father was 56 years old when Isoroku was born, and the name Isoroku literally meant 56 in Japanese, commemorating his father's age. He entered the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima in 1900, graduating in 1904 ranked 7th in a class of 300 students. His early career followed the traditional path of a Japanese naval officer, serving on cruisers and battleships during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. During the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905, Ensign Takano served aboard the cruiser Nisshin when an enemy shell exploded nearby, leaving him with permanent injuries. He lost 2 fingers on his left hand and carried scars across his torso for the rest of his life. In 1916, he was adopted into the Yamamoto family through marriage, taking the name by which history would remember him. By 1919, now a Navy captain, Yamamoto had established himself as an unusually intellectually curious officer with interests beyond pure naval tactics. The Navy recognized his potential and selected him for an extraordinary opportunity that would fundamentally shape his understanding of global power dynamics. In May 1919, Captain Yamamoto departed Japan for the United States. He had been assigned to study at Harvard University, part of a program to expose promising Japanese officers to Western education and thought. He arrived in America at age 35, older than typical graduate students, already a combat veteran with 17 years of naval service. What he encountered in America would alter his strategic worldview more profoundly than any battle. Yamamoto enrolled at Harvard in the autumn of 1919, studying English literature and economics while living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But his real education happened outside the classroom. He traveled extensively throughout the United States during his 2 years at Harvard, visiting industrial centers, oil fields, manufacturing plants, and critically, shipyards and naval facilities on both coasts. The visit to Newport News in May 1920 was among his first exposures to American industrial capacity operating at full scale. Standing on those docks, he watched American workers construct merchant vessels and warships with a speed and efficiency that had no parallel in Japan. The shipyard employed over 11,000 workers operating on multiple construction ways simultaneously. Yamamoto observed prefabricated sections being assembled, standardized components being mass-produced, and an industrial system optimized for volume rather than individual craftsmanship. Japanese shipbuilding, by contrast, emphasized traditional methods and individual expertise. Each ship was largely a custom creation, built by skilled artisans using techniques passed down through generations. The approach produced beautiful, well-crafted vessels, but it was catastrophically slow. Japanese shipyards might complete 1 warship in the time American yards launched 3 or 4, using less labor and fewer resources. Yamamoto documented his observations in detailed reports sent back to the Navy Ministry in Tokyo. He wrote about the fundamental difference between Japanese and American approaches to industrial production. Japan, he noted, had skilled workers and excellent designers, but America had something far more powerful, an industrial system built on standardization, mass production, and the assumption of unlimited resources. The implications for naval warfare were obvious and terrifying. During a visit to the Texas oil fields in 1921, Yamamoto witnessed petroleum production at a scale Japan could never achieve. He watched derricks pumping crude oil from dozens of wells simultaneously, feeding refineries that operated 24 hours a day. He calculated production figures and compared them to Japan's total oil reserves. The mathematics were brutally simple. In any extended conflict, Japan would run out of oil within 2 years. America could increase production almost indefinitely. This observation became central to Yamamoto's later strategic thinking. Japan's entire war plan in the Pacific would eventually revolve around seizing oil fields in the Dutch East Indies to fuel the imperial war machine. But Yamamoto understood that even if Japan captured every oil field in Southeast Asia, they could never match American petroleum production. The United States produced approximately 60% of the world's oil in 1941. Japan produced almost none domestically and depended entirely on imports. Any interruption in supply meant immediate strategic collapse. Yamamoto returned to Japan in October 1921, but his American education was far from complete. In February 1925, now a Rear Admiral, he was assigned as Japanese Naval Attaché in Washington, D.C. This posting gave him unprecedented access to American military planning, naval facilities, and most importantly, American political and industrial leadership. Between 1925 and 1927, Admiral Yamamoto attended countless diplomatic functions, congressional hearings, and industrial conferences. He met American admirals, senators, and business leaders. He visited factories in Detroit producing automobiles on assembly lines, steel mills in Pittsburgh, and aircraft plants in California. Each visit reinforced the same conclusion. American industrial capacity operated on a scale Japan could not comprehend, let alone challenge. In Detroit, Yamamoto toured the Ford River Rouge complex, the largest integrated factory in the world. The complex employed over 75,000 workers and could transform raw materials into finished automobiles in less than 2 days. Yamamoto watched iron ore arrive by ship, get smelted into steel, formed into car bodies, assembled with engines and components, and driven away as completed vehicles, all within a single massive facility. He calculated that this one factory complex had more productive capacity than Japan's entire automobile industry. The strategic implications were inescapable. If America could apply these mass production techniques to weapons manufacturing, no amount of Japanese fighting spirit or tactical superiority could overcome the resulting material disparity. One American factory could outproduce 10 Japanese factories. One American shipyard could launch more vessels in a year than Japan's entire naval construction program. Yamamoto's reports to Tokyo during this period grew increasingly pessimistic about Japan's ability to prevail in any extended conflict with the United States. He wrote detailed analyses comparing Japanese and American industrial capacity across multiple sectors: steel production, oil refining, shipbuilding, aircraft manufacturing, and automotive production. In every category, American capacity exceeded Japan's by factors of 5, 10, or even 20 to 1. His superiors in Tokyo read these reports with growing discomfort. Many senior officers dismissed Yamamoto's concerns as defeatism or excessive admiration for the enemy. They believed Japanese spiritual strength, superior tactics, and willingness to sacrifice would overcome material disadvantages. They pointed to Japan's victories over China and Russia as evidence that industrial capacity mattered less than fighting spirit and proper training. Yamamoto understood this perspective was dangerously delusional. Modern industrial warfare wasn't about individual courage or tactical brilliance. It was about production capacity, resource availability, and the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Japan excelled at producing individual warships or aircraft of exceptional quality. But in a war of attrition, quality couldn't compensate for overwhelming quantitative disadvantage. In 1928, Yamamoto returned to Japan and took command of the aircraft carrier Akagi. His experiences in America had convinced him of another critical reality: aviation would dominate future naval warfare. Battleships, long considered the ultimate expression of naval power, would become obsolete in conflicts where carrier-based aircraft could strike from hundreds of miles away. This understanding, also gained partially from observing American aviation development, would shape his later planning for Pearl Harbor. Throughout the 1930s, as Yamamoto rose through the naval hierarchy, he consistently advocated for policies that would avoid war with the United States. He opposed Japan's alliance with Nazi Germany, arguing it would inevitably lead to conflict with America and Britain simultaneously. He opposed the invasion of China, warning that it would drain Japanese resources and create an enemy of the United States. He was one of the few senior officers who publicly stated that Japan could not defeat America in a prolonged war. These positions made Yamamoto extremely unpopular with ultranationalist factions within the military and government. He received numerous death threats from right-wing extremists who considered him a traitor and defeatist. The Navy Ministry assigned him bodyguards and limited his public appearances. In 1939, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, partially to protect him from assassination, by placing him at sea where extremists couldn't reach him. Yet even as Yamamoto argued against war, he recognized that political forces beyond his control were driving Japan toward confrontation with the United States. Japanese expansion in China, the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, and Japan's move into French Indochina in 1941 created an escalating cycle of American economic sanctions. By July 1941, the United States had frozen Japanese assets, and imposed an oil embargo that gave Japan approximately 18 months of fuel reserves before complete military paralysis. Faced with this reality, Yamamoto concluded that if war was inevitable, Japan's only hope lay in achieving such a devastating initial blow that America would negotiate a settlement rather than commit to total war. This strategic assessment led directly to the planning of the Pearl Harbor attack. Yamamoto didn't believe the attack would win the war. He believed it might create a brief window during which Japan could seize resource-rich territories and establish a defensive perimeter that would be too costly for America to breach. During planning sessions for Pearl Harbor in autumn 1941, Yamamoto reportedly told Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono, "If ordered to fight, I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months, but I have absolutely no confidence about what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years." This wasn't modesty or pessimism. It was mathematical certainty based on his direct observation of American industrial capacity. Yamamoto calculated specific production ratios. In 1941, American steel production was approximately 75 million tons annually. Japan produced approximately 7 million tons. American shipyards could construct naval vessels at roughly 10 times Japan's rate. American aircraft production was increasing exponentially, from roughly 6,000 planes in 1940 to over 19,000 in 1941, with plans to reach 50,000 by 1943. Japan's entire aircraft industry couldn't match even the 1940 American production figure. The attack on Pearl Harbor succeeded beyond its tactical objectives. Japanese carrier aircraft sank or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed over 2,000 Americans, all while losing only 29 Japanese planes and 5 midget submarines. In Tokyo, the military leadership celebrated. They had validated their superiority, proven that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage, and bought Japan time to establish its defensive perimeter across the Pacific. Yamamoto's reaction was fundamentally different. According to multiple historical accounts, he expressed no joy at the tactical success. When staff officers congratulated him, he reportedly reminded them that they had started a war Japan could not win. He pointed out that the attack had failed in its most critical objective. Not a single American aircraft carrier had been damaged because all 3 Pacific Fleet carriers were at sea during the attack. More critically, the attack had achieved exactly what Yamamoto feared most. It had unified American public opinion and guaranteed that the United States would fight until Japan's total defeat. Before Pearl Harbor, American sentiment was divided about entering the war. After Pearl Harbor, that debate ended instantly. Yamamoto had lived in America long enough to understand American psychology. They might debate entering a war, but once attacked, they would pursue it with relentless determination until absolute victory. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's predictions about American industrial response began manifesting. President Franklin Roosevelt announced production goals that Japanese intelligence initially dismissed as propaganda. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943, 8 million tons of new shipping by the end of 1943. Japanese analysts calculated these figures were impossible, representing production increases of over 1,000% in some categories. But Yamamoto knew better. He had seen the Ford River Rouge complex. He had watched American shipyards operate at scales Japan couldn't imagine. He understood American industrial capacity in ways his colleagues did not. When Roosevelt announced these targets, Yamamoto recognized them not as propaganda, but as realistic assessments based on America's ability to convert automobile factories into aircraft plants and commercial shipyards into naval construction facilities literally overnight. The fundamental asymmetry was becoming clear. Japan had achieved tactical surprise and temporary naval superiority in the Pacific, but they were fighting an enemy that could replace every ship Japan sank 3 times over, could produce aircraft faster than Japan could train pilots to fly them, and possessed oil reserves that made Japan's captured Southeast Asian fields look like puddles by comparison. By mid-1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the mathematical realities Yamamoto had calculated were beginning to materialize. American industrial production was accelerating at rates that Japanese planning had considered impossible. Shipyards that had been building one vessel per month in 1941 were launching one vessel per week by mid-1942. Aircraft factories were doubling, then tripling output. The arsenal of democracy that Yamamoto had observed firsthand in the 1920s and 30s was awakening, and its productive capacity would bury Japan under an avalanche of ships, planes, tanks, and munitions. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 would prove Yamamoto's analysis prophetic. Japan would lose 4 fleet carriers in a single day, representing years of construction and irreplaceable trained pilots. America, drawing on the industrial capacity Yamamoto had witnessed firsthand, would replace their losses within months and add dozens of new carriers beyond that. The disparity would only grow more extreme as the war progressed. Yamamoto's tragedy was that he understood all this with perfect clarity before the first shot was fired, yet couldn't prevent the catastrophe he foresaw. His visits to American shipyards and factories in the 1920s had given him knowledge his colleagues refused to accept. They believed in Bushido and fighting spirit. Yamamoto believed in production statistics and resource calculations. They saw tactical victories. Yamamoto saw strategic mathematics that could have only one outcome. In less than 2 years, Admiral Yamamoto would be dead, his aircraft ambushed by American fighters over Bougainville in April 1943. But the industrial avalanche he had predicted was already unstoppable. The sleeping giant was awake, and its productive capacity would prove exactly as overwhelming as Yamamoto had calculated standing on American docks decades earlier, watching a nation build ships and understanding that Japan could never hope to match it. The mathematical certainty Yamamoto had calculated on American docks became physical reality with shocking speed. The transformation began not on battlefields, but in factories, shipyards, and training facilities across the United States. What Japanese planning had considered impossible production targets were not only met but exceeded, often by substantial margins. The sleeping giant was not just awakening. It was mobilizing with an industrial fury that would rewrite the rules of modern warfare. In 1942, American shipyards launched approximately 5 million tons of new naval and merchant vessels. This single year's production exceeded Japan's total shipbuilding capacity for the entire war. By 1943, American production had nearly doubled again. The Essex-class fleet carriers, each displacing 27,000 tons and carrying over 90 aircraft, were being completed at a rate of roughly 1 per month. Japan, by comparison, completed only 6 fleet carriers during the entire war, and most of those were converted from other hull types. The Liberty Ship program exemplified American industrial philosophy in ways that would have been familiar to Yamamoto from his visits to Detroit and Newport News. These merchant vessels, each displacing 14,000 tons, were designed for maximum simplicity and speed of construction. Prefabricated sections were built in factories across the country, then assembled at shipyards using standardized methods. The average construction time for a Liberty ship dropped from 230 days in early 1942 to 42 days by the end of that year. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was constructed from keel laying to launch in just 4 days and 15.5 hours as a demonstration of American industrial capacity. Japanese intelligence officers received these reports and dismissed them as propaganda. No nation could build ocean-going vessels in less than a week. The claims were obviously exaggerated for morale purposes, but submarine commanders operating in Pacific shipping lanes were reporting something inexplicable. American merchant traffic was increasing despite aggressive Japanese submarine warfare. For every ship sunk, 2 or 3 appeared to replace it. The mathematics suggested impossibilities. Yet the ships kept coming. Aircraft production revealed the same pattern at even more extreme ratios. In 1941, Japan produced approximately 5,400 military aircraft across all types. American production that same year was approximately 19,000 aircraft. By 1942, American production had increased to 47,800 aircraft. By 1943, it reached 85,000. The United States was producing more aircraft in a single month than Japan produced in an entire year, and the quality gap was narrowing as American designs improved with combat experience. The disparity extended beyond mere numbers to include pilot training, maintenance capacity, and logistics infrastructure. American pilot training programs were graduating thousands of aviators monthly, with hundreds of flight hours of instruction per pilot. Japan's training programs, constrained by fuel shortages and limited training aircraft, were producing pilots with increasingly inadequate preparation as experienced instructors were pulled into combat roles and never returned. By 1943, Japanese replacement pilots were entering combat with less than half the flight hours of their American counterparts. Logistics revealed perhaps the starkest contrast between American industrial capacity and Japanese limitations. The U.S. Navy's floating repair ships could perform maintenance and repairs at advanced bases that would have required return to major shipyards for Japanese vessels. American supply ships kept forward bases stocked with spare parts, ammunition, fuel, and provisions in quantities that Japanese logistics officers found incomprehensible. A single American fleet train could support carrier operations for months without returning to Pearl Harbor. Japanese carriers needed to return to port for reprovisioning after mere weeks at sea. The Battle of Midway in early June 1942 provided the first devastating confirmation of Yamamoto's predictions. The battle itself was a tactical disaster for Japan, with 4 fleet carriers sunk in a single day, along with hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. But the aftermath revealed something more psychologically devastating. American industrial capacity made the losses essentially irrelevant to American strategic planning. The carrier USS Yorktown, severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, was declared by Japanese intelligence to have been sunk. When she appeared at Midway just weeks later after emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor that Japanese analysts calculated should have required months, it represented the first concrete evidence that American damage control and repair capabilities operated at scales beyond Japanese experience. When Yorktown was finally sunk at Midway, American newspapers mourned her loss. Japanese officers celebrated eliminating a veteran carrier. Neither side yet understood that Yorktown's loss was strategically meaningless. By the time she sank, 3 Essex-class carriers were already under construction, each more capable than Yorktown, and they would be operational within 18 months. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu. These represented years of construction, decades of accumulated naval aviation experience, and an institutional knowledge base that could not be replaced. Yamamoto understood immediately that Midway was not just a battle lost, but the beginning of inevitable strategic collapse. The combined fleet had sacrificed pieces in a game of attrition against an opponent who could replace every loss 3 times over while simultaneously expanding their total forces. By late 1942, frontline Japanese commanders were encountering American material superiority in direct, undeniable forms. At Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers discovered American supply dumps containing thousands of tons of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and equipment. The quantities were staggering. Individual American infantry units had more artillery ammunition available than entire Japanese divisions. American soldiers received 3 meals daily plus supplemental rations. Japanese soldiers were on reduced rations, increasingly malnourished, suffering from tropical diseases that well-supplied American medical units could treat, but Japanese medical personnel could not. A Japanese staff officer who inspected captured American positions on Guadalcanal wrote in his diary, "The Americans left behind more equipment in their retreat than our entire regiment possessed. How can we fight an enemy so wealthy they abandon wealth?" The question had no answer. Japanese strategic planning had always assumed rough material parity or compensating for inferiority through superior tactics and fighting spirit. No one had planned for an enemy whose supply wastage exceeded Japanese total supply capacity. The night naval battles around Guadalcanal in autumn 1942 provided another shock to Japanese confidence. Japan's long-lance torpedoes and superior night fighting doctrine gave them tactical advantages in surface combat. Japanese destroyers and cruisers won several engagements, sinking American vessels and demonstrating that Japanese technology and tactics remained superior in specific circumstances. But the victories meant nothing strategically. Every American ship sunk was replaced within months. Japanese losses were irreplaceable. The Imperial Navy was winning battles while losing a war of attrition it could never win. By early 1943, the industrial disparity Yamamoto had calculated was manifesting in overwhelming material superiority at every level of combat. American fighter pilots flew planes equipped with self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating, and radios in every aircraft. Japanese pilots still flew aircraft designed for maximum performance at the cost of protection, and radio equipment remained scarce. When American pilots were shot down over the Pacific, submarine rescue operations and seaplane pickups recovered many of them to fly again. Japanese pilots who ditched in the ocean were almost never recovered, their experience and training lost permanently. Replacement aircraft and spare parts arrived at American forward bases in quantities that seemed limitless to Japanese observers. An American fighter squadron that lost half its aircraft in combat could expect full replacement within a week. Japanese squadrons operated at partial strength for months, cannibalizing damaged aircraft for spare parts because replacement aircraft didn't exist. Maintenance crews worked miracles keeping fighters and bombers operational past their designed service lives, but mechanical breakdown rates increased steadily as the war progressed. American submarines in the Pacific, after solving the Mark 14 torpedo defects, began inflicting catastrophic losses on Japanese merchant shipping. By 1943, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant vessels faster than Japan could replace them, even accounting for captured vessels and emergency construction. The lifeline of resources from Southeast Asia to Japan was being severed methodically. Oil imports, critical to every aspect of Japanese military operations, fell precipitously. By late 1943, fuel shortages were affecting training operations, limiting naval movements, and reducing sortie rates for aircraft. Japanese naval commanders found themselves unable to conduct operations not because of tactical defeats, but because insufficient fuel existed to operate their remaining ships. The battleship Yamato, most powerful warship afloat, spent months at anchor in Truk Lagoon and later in Japanese home waters because fuel was too precious to waste on operations where American air power would likely sink her before she could engage enemy surface forces. The irony was bitter. Japan possessed powerful warships but lacked the fuel to operate them, while America possessed unlimited fuel and was building warships faster than crews could be trained to operate them. By mid-1943, American forces were advancing across the Pacific on multiple axes simultaneously, something Japanese strategic planning had considered impossible. Central Pacific forces were island-hopping toward the Marianas. Southwest Pacific forces were advancing along New Guinea toward the Philippines. Each offensive was supported by naval forces and air power that dwarfed anything Japan could concentrate for defense. Japanese commanders found themselves making triage decisions about which territories to defend and which to abandon, not because of tactical failures, but because insufficient forces existed to defend everywhere simultaneously. The most psychologically devastating aspect was that Japanese tactical performance remained high. Individual Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen fought with skill and determination that American forces respected and feared. Japanese defensive positions on islands like Tarawa and Peleliu inflicted casualties that shocked American planners. Kamikaze attacks in the war's final years demonstrated desperate courage that achieved tactical successes, but none of it mattered strategically. American industrial capacity could absorb losses that would have been strategically catastrophic for Japan and continue operations without pause. Yamamoto did not live to see the full manifestation of the industrial avalanche he had predicted. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his aircraft over Bougainville based on decoded intelligence about his inspection tour schedule. The shoot-down was surgical, executed by pilots who had been given specific orders to target Yamamoto's plane. He was killed instantly when his aircraft crashed into the jungle. His death removed the one senior Japanese naval officer who had understood from the beginning that Japan could not win an extended war with America. The officers who remained believed in fighting spirit, tactical excellence, and the possibility that American will could be broken through sufficient casualties. They had not stood on American docks in the 1920s watching ships being built at impossible speeds. They had not toured the Ford River Rouge complex and calculated its productive capacity. They had not witnessed American industrial culture and understood that mass production was not just technique, but philosophy, an approach to warfare that made traditional military calculations obsolete. By 1944, the industrial disparity had become so extreme that Japanese military effectiveness was degrading not from lack of courage or tactical skill, but from simple absence of material. Pilots flew increasingly obsolete aircraft against American fighters that outperformed them in every category. Ships sortied with insufficient fuel for return voyages, turning operations into one-way suicide missions. Infantry units faced American offensives with limited ammunition, inadequate anti-tank weapons, and no possibility of resupply or reinforcement. The prophecy Yamamoto had made in autumn 1941 came true with mathematical precision. Japan fought effectively for approximately 6 months after Pearl Harbor, achieving tactical victories and territorial expansion. But by mid-1942, the American industrial response was already overwhelming Japanese capacity to sustain operations. By 1943, the outcome was no longer in doubt, only the timeline to inevitable defeat. The sleeping giant Yamamoto had warned about was fully awake, and its industrial strength was exactly as overwhelming as he had calculated standing on those Virginia docks in May 1920, watching a nation build ships and understanding that Japan could never hope to match it. The final 18 months of the Pacific War demonstrated not merely American material superiority, but something more profound: the complete validation of every calculation Yamamoto had made on American docks 2 decades earlier. By late 1944, the disparity between Japanese capacity and American production had become so extreme that combat operations resembled not battles between peer militaries, but the systematic dismantling of a force that had exhausted its ability to resist. The Philippine Sea engagement in June 1944, nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, revealed the full consequences of Japan's inability to replace losses in trained personnel and modern equipment. Japanese naval aviation launched over 400 aircraft against American Task Force 58. American carrier fighters, guided by radar early warning and coordinated by radio communication, intercepted the Japanese formations before they reached the American fleet. The battle lasted roughly 7 hours. Japan lost approximately 300 aircraft and 2 fleet carriers. American losses were 23 aircraft. The mathematical exchange ratio spoke to something beyond tactical competence. Japanese pilots in 1944 were flying aircraft inferior to American fighters, with inadequate training due to fuel shortages, without effective radios for coordination, and against American radar systems that eliminated tactical surprise. They fought with courage and determination that American pilots acknowledged. But courage could not compensate for systematic material and training disadvantages that compounded with every month of war. More devastating was what happened after the battle. American carriers recovered most of their downed pilots. Damaged American aircraft were repaired overnight or replaced from ship stores. Losses in aircraft and pilots were made good within weeks from replacement pools training in the United States. For Japan, the 300 lost aircraft and their pilots represented irreplaceable losses. No replacement aircraft existed. Pilot training programs, starved for fuel and aircraft, could not produce adequately trained replacements. The combined fleet's carrier aviation had been effectively destroyed as a combat force. The contrast extended to every aspect of naval operations. American destroyers operated with fuel enough for weeks of sustained combat operations. Japanese destroyers ran on minimal fuel loads, sometimes towing barges of supplies because their fuel was too precious to waste on cargo vessels. American sailors ate hot meals 3 times daily with coffee, fresh fruit when available, and nutritional supplements. Japanese sailors subsisted on reduced rations, often lacking fresh food entirely, with malnutrition and disease rates climbing steadily throughout the fleet. American warships damaged in combat were repaired at forward bases or returned to shipyards for rapid restoration. The carrier USS Franklin, catastrophically damaged by Japanese aircraft in March 1945 with over 700 crew killed, was sailed back to the United States and could have been repaired to return to service if the war had continued. Japanese carriers damaged in combat were often scrapped or used as training vessels because industrial capacity to properly repair them no longer existed. By autumn 1944, American submarine operations had essentially severed Japan's maritime supply lines. Japanese merchant shipping losses exceeded 1 million tons in 1944 alone. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies, the strategic resource that Japan had initiated the war to secure, fell to a trickle. By early 1945, Japanese industry was shutting down not from bombing, but from simple lack of raw materials. Aircraft factories had aluminum for only partial production runs. Shipyards had steel for only the most critical repairs. Refineries operated at minimal capacity because crude oil wasn't arriving. The strategic situation Yamamoto had predicted with precision in 1941 had materialized exactly as calculated. Japan had fought effectively for 6 months. By 1 year, American industrial response was overwhelming Japanese capacity. By 2 years, Japan was losing the war of attrition catastrophically. By 3 years, the outcome was no longer in question, only whether Japan would surrender or force America to invade the home islands at horrific cost. The bombing campaign against Japanese cities in 1944 and 1945 demonstrated American material abundance in its most terrible form. Boeing B-29 superfortresses, each costing over $600,000 to manufacture, operated from bases in the Marianas, dropping thousands of tons of incendiary bombs on Japanese cities. The March 19, 1945 firebombing of Tokyo killed an estimated 100,000 civilians in a single night, more than would die in the initial atomic bombing of Hiroshima 4 months later. Japan possessed neither the fighter aircraft nor the anti-aircraft ammunition to defend against these raids effectively. American bombers operated at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to reach them. When Japanese fighters did intercept, they often lacked ammunition for sustained combat. Anti-aircraft batteries fired reduced barrages to conserve scarce ammunition. The strategic bombing campaign continued with minimal American losses, destroying Japanese cities methodically, because Japan no longer possessed the material capacity to defend its own territory. The kamikazes represented Japan's response to overwhelming material disadvantage, substituting human sacrifice for technological and industrial capacity. Beginning systematically at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese pilots flew deliberately suicidal attacks against American ships. The tactic achieved tactical successes, sinking dozens of vessels and damaging hundreds more. But strategically, kamikaze attacks validated Yamamoto's analysis. Japan was trading trained pilots and aircraft on one-way missions because industrial capacity to sustain conventional operations no longer existed. They were spending lives because they had exhausted material resources. American forces absorbed kamikaze casualties and continued operations. The losses, though painful, represented a tiny fraction of total American naval strength. Ships damaged by kamikaze attacks were repaired or replaced. Crew casualties, though tragic, did not affect overall operational capacity. The kamikazes demonstrated desperation, not strength, and American forces adapted with improved anti-aircraft defenses, radar picket ships, and combat air patrols that reduced kamikaze effectiveness steadily. By spring 1945, the mathematical endgame Yamamoto had calculated 4 years earlier was playing out with brutal clarity. American forces stood at Okinawa, 350 miles from the Japanese home islands. The invasion had been preceded by naval bombardment from battleships that fired thousands of shells daily, quantities that exceeded Japanese total ammunition stocks for entire defensive sectors. American aircraft flew thousands of sorties daily. American supply ships unloaded material faster than ground forces could consume it. Japanese defenders on Okinawa fought with desperate skill, inflicting over 62,000 American casualties, including 12,000 killed. But they fought with declining ammunition stocks, no air support, no naval support, and no possibility of reinforcement or resupply. The battle lasted 82 days. Its outcome was never in doubt, only the casualty count required for American victory. The Yamato's final sortie in April 1945 epitomized the strategic bankruptcy of Japanese military planning by war's end. The largest battleship ever constructed, displacing 72,000 tons and mounting the most powerful naval guns ever placed aboard a warship, was sent on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa with insufficient fuel to return. The operation was not strategic calculation, but theatrical gesture, an attempt to demonstrate that the Imperial Navy still existed and still possessed fighting spirit. American carrier aircraft intercepted Yamato 200 miles from Okinawa on April 7th. Over 2 hours, nearly 400 American aircraft attacked the battleship in coordinated waves. Yamato absorbed at least 10 torpedo hits and over 7 bomb hits before capsizing and exploding. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors died. American losses were 10 aircraft and 12 crew. The battle demonstrated conclusively that battleships, no matter how powerful, could not survive concentrated air attack without air cover. More fundamentally, it demonstrated that Japan was expending irreplaceable assets on operationally meaningless gestures because no strategic options remained. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, ended the war before American invasion of the home islands became necessary. The atomic bombs were products of American industrial and scientific capacity. The Manhattan Project cost over $2 billion and employed over 130,000 people at its peak, an investment possible only for a nation with America's resources. Japan had explored atomic weapons research and concluded the industrial requirements were beyond their capacity even before the war began. The final accounting of the Pacific War validated every element of Yamamoto's strategic analysis from 1941. Japan fought effectively for approximately 6 months after Pearl Harbor, exactly as he predicted. American industrial response overwhelmed Japanese capacity by the 1-year mark, exactly as he calculated. By the war's end, the material disparity had become so extreme that Japanese military forces, still fighting with courage and skill, simply lacked the equipment, fuel, ammunition, and supplies to resist effectively. American industrial production during the war included over 300,000 aircraft, 87,000 tanks, over 6,000 naval vessels including 124 aircraft carriers of all types, 47 million tons of artillery ammunition, and 44 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. Japanese production across all categories combined did not equal American production in any single category. The arsenal of democracy that Yamamoto had observed in the 1920s had produced exactly the material avalanche he had predicted, and Japan had drowned beneath it. The tragedy of Yamamoto's story lies not in his tactical failures, but in his strategic accuracy. He understood with perfect clarity before the war began that Japan could not defeat America in extended combat. He based this understanding not on abstract theory or optimistic assumptions, but on direct observation of American industrial capacity. He had stood in shipyards and watched vessels built at impossible speeds. He had toured factories and calculated their productive potential. He had measured American oil production and compared it to Japanese consumption. Every calculation pointed to the same conclusion. In any extended war, American material superiority would prove overwhelming. Yet this knowledge could not prevent the catastrophe. Institutional momentum, political pressure, and strategic circumstances beyond any individual's control drove Japan toward war despite Yamamoto's warnings. His role became planning the attack he knew would ultimately fail, leading forces he knew could not win. Fighting a war he had calculated was lost before it began. The final irony is that Yamamoto's visit to American docks in May 1920, watching ships being built and calculating production rates in his notebook, represented the most accurate strategic intelligence Japan received about American capacity throughout the entire pre-war period. One officer's direct observations proved more valuable than all of Japan's formal intelligence assessments. But institutional culture that valued fighting spirit over material calculation, that believed tactical excellence could compensate for industrial disadvantage, that assumed American will would break before Japanese determination, rejected the evidence Yamamoto provided. On those Virginia docks in 1920, Captain Yamamoto had seen his nation's future. He had watched American workers building destroyers on parallel construction ways, calculated the production rates, compared them to Japanese capacity, and understood what would happen if these two industrial systems ever engaged in total war. 21 years later, standing aboard the Nagato after Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto knew the sleeping giant was awake. And 23 years after that calculation in Virginia, Japan surrendered unconditionally, having been buried under exactly the industrial avalanche he had predicted with mathematical precision. The Pacific War was decided not on battlefields, but in factories, shipyards, and oil fields. It was determined not by courage or tactical skill, which both sides possessed in abundance, but by industrial capacity and resource availability. Yamamoto understood this truth before anyone else in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had seen American industrial power firsthand, measured it carefully, and calculated its implications accurately. His tragedy was that he was right, and no one listened until it was far too late to matter. The ships he had watched being built in Virginia in 1920 would be succeeded by thousands more. The industrial system he had observed would be applied to weapons production with devastating efficiency, and the mathematical certainty he had calculated, standing on American docks with his notebook, would prove absolutely, terribly correct. Japan could not win. Yamamoto had known it from the beginning, and knowing changed nothing.